Good evening. Welcome to the Korea Society. I'm Jo, Senior Director of Arts and Culture. So the month of May is the Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, as well as the Mental Health Awareness Month. A great deal of stigma still remains on conversation regarding mental health among AAPI communities, and the issue is often shrouded by silence and shame, allowing misconception and minimization of mental health concerns. Amid historic level of anti-Asian violence, it is crucial to recognize the intergenerational trauma from immigration and racism and share stories that show the fullness of the AAPI experience in order to educate and form alliance. We are honored to have two guests tonight for our conversation on this extremely timely and important topic. Dr. Shinhee Han is a senior psychotherapist at the New School University Counseling Service and in private practice in New York City. She is an adjunct professor at Columbia University's Center for Study of Ethnicity and Race and the co-author of Racial Melancholia, Racial Dissociation on the Social and Psychic Lives of Asian Americans, which was published in 2019. Heidi Shin is a journalist, public radio and podcast producer and writer. Her writings and works have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, BBC, WGBH, and PRI's The World, amongst many other outlets. Heidi also teaches about podcasting at the PRX Podcast Garage, Harvard University Sound Lab, and leads Boston's Sonic Soiree. So welcome to the Korea Society, Dr. Han and Heidi. It is so great to have you here.
Oh, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So, Heidi, I want to start with you because in March of last year, just almost exactly a year ago, you wrote an article that was published in New York Times titled, "I'm Helping My Korean American Daughter Embrace Her Identity to Counter Racism." So, can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to write that article? And for those of us who may not have read it, what was it about?
Sure. Well, let me start off by saying I'm Korean American and I grew up here in New York. And when I was a kid, there were two things that I absolutely despised. And the first was piano lessons. And the second was going to Korean school on Saturday mornings. So I vowed that when I became a parent, those two things would never happen in my house. Of course, I had a daughter. She turned 5 years old, and she says, "Why can't I talk to my 할머니?" who doesn't speak English. And she says, "I'm going to go to Korean school." And she says, "I'm going to sign up for piano." That's what it's like being a parent. So we show up at Korean school. It's a Korean church basement that smells like Korean food. And the principal hands me this form and asks me to fill it out. And you're supposed to put your child's name and their Korean name. But when I get to Korean name, I realize, oh my gosh, she's 5 years old and I never gave her a Korean name. And I felt this really deep sense of failure and loss in that moment, actually. You fast forward to about a year or two later, it's the start of the pandemic. Now my daughter's 6 years old in the first grade in public school, and the teacher gives the class an assignment, which is to write about a problem in the world and how you can solve it. My daughter, she writes about how women should be paid the same as men. So I feel really proud of her, amen to that. And then she goes on to say there's a student in her class who also wrote about how COVID is a problem and Chinese Americans should not be allowed in this country. And then the rest of the day, the kids in the class are asking her, "Are you Chinese?" This launched a series of conversations in my house that I realized I was not equipped to have. And so the piece was published in the Times. The piece talks about how we responded and eventually how the things I did right and wrong, and the psychologists who I talked to, and the advocates who told me what I should have said, because the chances are this is going to happen again and you should be ready for it. Because according to research that's been done the past 2 years with the Stop AAPI organization, Dr. Russell Jung's organization out at UCSF, they have shown at SFSU, they've shown that 1 in 4 Asian American youth during the pandemic has experienced some type of racial harassment or violence or bullying. So that's a really high number, 1 in 4. So that means if you're Asian American or know somebody who is or a child is, there's a chance that they've seen or heard something. But if you haven't heard about it from them, the chances are that they are talking to their peers about it without you. And that often leads to things like reinforcing stereotypes along the way, which lead to much larger issues down the line, like what we saw in Atlanta. So in terms of why did I write this piece? In many ways, I wanted other families who are in the same position, in the same space as us, to know how to respond. But in reality, the piece was published 3 days after the Atlanta shootings, when 6 Asian American women were shot. But the essay itself, I had started to write in my head, I think, years before. When I became a parent. And it was the kind of thing that I had running, bits and pieces and anecdotes that I had been running and recording in the back of my mind. And in part, it was because when I had my own child, I had to start struggling with which parts of my identity I was going to pass on to her and which ones I knew would fall to the wayside. First, it was an essay for me to find voice for my own story. Then it became an essay which got cut down by like 1,000 words. All the beautiful lyrical parts actually were taken out. Thank you to my excellent editor, Roberta Zeff, who helped me cut out lots of really beautiful parts. And we replaced those parts with what we call service, which is advice that we thought families needed to hear that week the shootings happened.
And I think what you just said was very important, that it wasn't just about the response to what had happened since the pandemic began. Obviously, the pandemic, not to mention the increased violence against AAPI communities, such as the mass shooting in Atlanta and all the violence you cannot not see on your social media feed, certainly has brought this issue foreground to the many people. But I was also wondering if that's the case for everyone, Asian Americans and non-Asian Americans alike. And I wanted to ask you, Dr. Han, I know you're very much, protective of your patients' privacy, but just generally speaking, have you heard people speaking more about the issue recently? Are they people more aware? Are they more anxious?
Sure. I actually wanted to respond to what you just said because that you wrote it for yourself. And I think that was your mourning, that it compelled you to bring all of your history together to actually express and as a part of healing and to share in this kind of a community, right? The Asian American and non-Asian American allies. Because that's how David Ng and I, who wrote the book Racial Melancholia, Racial Dissociation, we wrote our first article on racial melancholia as a response to all the losses on Columbia campus, and that it was our way of mourning for those who had been lost. And so I totally understand like where you're coming from, that kind of need for healing, need to verbalize, right? First, what happened, right?
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And actually, earlier drafts of the essay, I hid for a while, and then I ended up sharing with other Korean American friends. But what surprised me was I thought it was a personal story, but I was surprised by how many of them said, "That's my story too," and it's right.
Exactly,
Yeah.
that we're not alone. So I actually just want to thank the Korea Society for having us tonight. And actually, it's so incredible. I haven't been here, but that the fact that Korea Society would focus on the topic of mental health that is usually visible, I really want to commend them in bringing this forum. And I also want to give a big shout out to my class who are all, I can't believe it, you guys. Thank you for coming. This is my seminar class at Columbia, Asian Americans in Psychology of Race. They rock, they're rock stars. And we're in good hands with them. So have I been noticing? Absolutely. So many people, so many Asian Americans are seeking therapy since the pandemic, since the increase in the Asian violence that have become more visible. And they're all having panic attacks. And they're all feeling so scared and terrified and helpless. And that it has really brought to forefront the need to really understand our Asian American history and to educate ourselves and to really learn the language of emotional and psychological narratives, the narratives that many of the young people have been told, young adults and adults alike have been told, that our families have immigrated because our parents have sacrificed themselves to bring better future for us, and we have worked really hard, and why are we not happy? Why are we working like dogs, and we feel so empty and exhausted? And so a lot of the work that I have been doing with Asian American clients have been really around this question of dissociation, where the cognitive development has excelled so fast. Like all parents really reward children who get A's and do well in school, but at what cost, right? And so early on in life, they already know, oh, my mom gives me more love and affection when I do well in school. So, in order to excel in your cognitive and intellectual development, something has to take a back seat. And often that's the psychological and emotional development. So, by high school, their intellectual development is super mature, but their emotional and psychological development is really lagging as young children. But when we make decisions, we need both our intellect and our intuitive and emotional and psychological intuitiveness to make solid decisions. And often they're split. And that's a really unhealthy dissociation of severing oneself. And I think that through the pandemic, this Zoom experience has intensified that dissociation, because we're like talking heads from neck up, and we're like bobbing, and we're like, we're talking, but we don't see the rest of us. And I think that when there have been more and more violence, I was just sharing with you guys that at workplace and at school, no one is acknowledging that there has been violence. And you're supposed to just keep your head down and work like automatons. And then your body's freaking out. Like, I don't know what to do. I'm so scared. And that severance, in therapy has been all about bringing the two together.
So you've been speaking with a lot of young people because throughout your career you've been working in the sort of the university college um, environment. Have you noticed that there has been any changes for the reason why they are seeking therapy, or has there been sort of the generational shifts?
Mm-hmm.
Say, people who are now in their early 50s or 40s versus students who are in their 20s. Are they still coming because they feel like they were always pushed to get A's and go to good schools, or has there been some fundamental change because of the different generations and the different times we're living in?
Sure. In our book with David Ang, we really, in the beginning, we started with this Generation X. And a lot of the students came in because they were feeling depressed. And what I mean by depression is that the anger is turned inward. That is the definition of depression. And they felt really stuck. Students who were queer couldn't come out, and they would turn that lack of language and validation inward, and they would be depressed. In the Generation Y, well, first of all, no one goes to therapy just to say, well, I feel like let me pay a lot of money and like learn about me. I mean, I wish everybody did that, but generally people go to therapy because they're in real crisis. And they don't go to therapy because they're racist. They go to therapy because they're having currently panic attacks and feeling really dispersed in this kind of dissociated sense of self. And so I think there's been a real shift. And on top of that, we're seeing a lot of parachute kids who come alone, literally parachute, like drop down. And as young as 8 years old, they are put into boarding schools. They live, if they come a little bit later, they live in like boarding houses or alone. And they don't have any sense of a context for Asian American history. And one student from Myanmar recently said, I protested against the coup. And so I'm blacklisted in my own home country and I can't go back. So my parents said, go to America and get a college degree and you'll be safer there. And then all, like Michelle Go and Christina Yu, right, were just murdered. And she said to me, really scared, she said, I came here because I thought it was going to be safer for me, but am I going to be murdered for just being Asian? And so that kind of disconnect, right, that we've been feeling, and it's not just her, it's all of us, I think, as Asian Americans who have been taught to follow the rules, to be a good model minority, and then to because I think a lot about why Michelle Gu was pushed off the subway. And they keep saying this perpetrator has mental illness. But how is it that in his unconscious that he argued with the white woman and the white woman fought back? But somehow in his unconscious, did he assume that the Asian American woman would not fight back? And what is that about, right? Why is it that this person is mentally ill, but that somewhere in him racism persisted and that he chose the Asian American woman?
Whether that was deliberate or not,
Exactly.
he did make that choice.
He made that choice, absolutely.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to that, where do these racial biases come from and where do they start? And in some of the research that I've done, psychologists have noted that, kids as young as 2, 3 years old can already recognize differences in things like skin color and hair color, but they don't really have the language around it yet. And by the time they're 5 or 6 years old, they're already talking amongst themselves about differences that they see and stereotypes that they see, especially in the media, in books and in television and in movies that they consume. So if there aren't adults who are guiding those conversations with them, those stereotypes are being solidified at a really young age.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, if you're not white, oh, you're ugly. Or,
Yeah.
And then you believe it because no one is saying anything.
Right. My daughter had a doll. I bought her an Asian American doll. We filled our house now with books about characters of all different diverse backgrounds and toys and things like that. And I once brought home her a doll when she was about 2 years old, and it was an Asian American doll. And she looked up, and the first thing she said to me was, Mom, its eyes are broken. So where do you learn that from?
Mm-hmm.
It's because all the other dolls in the house look different, right? So it starts very early.
Exactly.
And why would you associate the fact that the doll had slightly smaller eyes meant it was broken?
Right.
Because probably it's just the only one that looked different. So it's always, and I wanted to actually ask you a little bit about all the coverage that has been happening in the last 2 years, because I personally feel like I just cannot escape the news. It almost feels like you can't escape it. But you also have this sense that that may not be the case for the rest of the world. That sense of we are the only ones who are aware of it. And maybe we are the only ones, again, that sense of are we making a big deal out of nothing? Like, was that really racial or not? Like that sort of thinking that goes behind. So I wanted to ask you about all this talk about what's happening. What does that do to people who are so hyper aware of it? Will it increase their anxiety? Will that really make them scared even more? Or is there a way to really absorb all this information in a more meaningful and helpful way?
That's a really good question. I mean, I struggle with it because what's been so interesting is that when a patient comes in to talk, there is a separation between a therapist and a patient and their realities. But since the pandemic, we've been sharing this reality together. And so it's been very interesting to kind of sit with people when we're both feeling anxious, we're both really scared to walk home or take the subway home. And I think that some people are far more sensitive, and you don't have to consume all the social media and the news constantly. I think that it can become addictive, and it can be, I don't know how good that is for mental health, actually. And in some ways, you have to really protect yourself. You have to know your foundation. And so I think one of the really common themes in my practice that has been coming to forefront with many of the Asian American clients has to do with why did I work so hard to become a model minority? Why did I work so hard to lose my language, that to the point where now I can't communicate with my parents? Why did I work so hard to assimilate and get rid of my accent and feel ashamed of my parents' accents? Why did I work so hard to, I thought that I have so many clients in their early 30s who have said, I went to Ivy League school, I did everything they told me to do, I got a great job, and now they didn't tell me that just working hard isn't good enough. And so, why did I follow all these rules just to be told that racism is in my face all the time, that glass ceiling is right there for me, and that they keep telling me my evaluations that I'm not assertive enough, I'm too quiet, I'm too compliant, and but that's what rewarded me throughout. And so, this kind of process of mourning all the losses and the consequences of assimilation process has to take place, I think. And then you have to actually educate yourself, because I don't know how many of you were taught Asian American history in grade school, middle school, high school, or college, but it's rare that you've ever had an Asian American teacher. It's rare that you've read. I mean, like your daughter's gonna thank you so much for educating her so early on, but many households are not like that. And so I think that people in my practice, they have been reading Asian American literature, they have been reading Asian American history, they have been talking to other people, they've been going to, book talks and Asian American community talks, and learning and re-educating, and to the place where they can come to reclaim their identity. Like what you said about writing this piece, it was such a cathartic experience, right? That you didn't even know that that was your actually the unconscious goal,
Right.
but your body took you there.
Right. And in fact, after writing the piece, our school systems shut down along with the rest of the country a few weeks later. And I found myself becoming this homeschool teacher, right? And I took it upon myself to say, hey, let's study Asian American history. You're not going to learn it in school. We're going to learn it here. And so we learned about what happened on Angel Island, like who came through there and how it was and was not like Ellis Island when Chinese laborers came through the West Coast. We also, learned about Vincent Chen and all sorts of violence against Asian Americans. But I also got this, and eventually, I actually had my daughter. There were 22 kids in her classroom, right, who now heard that Chinese people should not be allowed in this country. And we felt like we had to do something about that. So the lesson plans we created at home, I wanted to go and teach in the schools, but couldn't. So we had our 7-year-old go in and teach a week's worth of lessons about our personal family's immigration history. And now the school has incorporated that into the curriculum. And there's this sort of movement across the country to try to do this. And one, it was healing for my daughter to be able to go and share the story of why we're allowed in this country, why she's allowed in this country. But two, I wanted to address sort of like what, how much is too much? When are the headlines too hard? Right. And this is something that I talk about as a parent, but also as a journalist. unfortunately, like if it bleeds, it leads. There are all these headlines that are just overly graphic and overly violent. And we have this like now with social media, people who don't care choose not to read. And people who do care maybe read too much. And so there's this challenge, this balance there. But one thing that I've sort of encouraged people to do is find the solutions that you're seeing. Don't just read about the problems when you're consuming news. And so, for example, when I'm thinking about curriculum, about Asian American curriculum for schools, we talk about not just what happened to Vincent Chin and the case that he lost unfairly for the violence committed against him, but what about Mamie Tate, who was an 8-year-old girl in San Francisco? I don't know how many of you know, but in the 1800s, Asian Americans were not allowed into schools with white children in San Francisco, a very little known part of our country's history. And an 8-year-old Chinese American girl said, that's not fair. And she told her parents, who said, that's not fair. And they took the case all the way to the Supreme Court and won, which is why we have kids, Chinese American kids with white American kids in public schools in San Francisco today. And so it's talking about not ignoring history and not ignoring the hard news. It's taking the news and finding the solutions and finding the ways people are being agents of change in circumstances that are unjust.
Absolutely. I mean, okay, just FYI, that Mimi Tate's story is written by May Nai in the, what is it? The Luckiest Americans. Thank you. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, is it the lucky ones? I'm
The
sorry.
lucky
Yeah.
ones. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's just fascinating. But you're second generation
Yes.
and you are working through it. I was just wondering, speaking of learning your history and trying to learn more about it, of all your patients who are in their 30s, they must have their parents who are probably in their 60s and 70s. They're probably first generation immigrants. Do they recognize, I don't want to say the damage, but do they recognize what has happened? Do they understand why their second generation children may feel this way? Do they understand that maybe, trying to push your child to assimilate, even if they didn't even realize what that really meant? Do you think there is a sort of a shift in the point of view of that generation when they look at their children? Or do they just say, you guys are really spoiled and you guys should be able to fight this? And
What's wrong with being spoiled? I think that, I mean, I'm an 1.5, and I think it depends on the parents who immigrate. So one of the things about immigrants is that when they come to America, their values and what they fantasize or remember about their home country is actually from their childhood and not when they left. And so my parents came in the mid 70s, but what they brought with them in their values was actually from the 50s, from the Korean War. And they kept emphasizing all these things about like life and death, and black and white, right and wrong. And a lot of the immigrant parents are amazing. They're amazing. And their goal in life is for financial stability. And they are what I would define as surviving. Their whole goal is surviving. And what does that look like? Establishing financial stability, making sure their children get education, making sure that they are safe, right? So at the cost of having lost their home, their language, all these cultural norms that they came with, friends, extended family, it could be so many things, right? And that's kind of wrapped up in this, what we call racial melancholia. And then the children follow through with all these assimilation processes, and their goal is no longer about surviving. Their goal is to live. And live means a little spoiling. Live means going on vacations. Live means they have a nice apartment and that they live a very white type of white middle class, upper middle class family style. And that's the goal, right? And then so on and so on. And so I had this one wonderful patient long time ago who wanted to be a writer in college, but she studied history and then went to law school and became a corporate lawyer. And when in the first year she got a huge bonus and she paid off all her debt, and then she said to her parents, I'm making a lot of money, you can stop working in the factories, I'm going to buy you a house and you can go on vacations. And she thought that that was the goal that the family had together. And then the parents just looked at her like, what are you talking about? We don't know how to go on vacation. We don't have hobbies. We don't know what to do with ourselves if we quit our job. So you go live and we're just going to stay. And so this is the disconnect, right? And I have a current patient there's 3 children, and they're scientists, they're like business people, they're very successful. And yet they don't speak any Korean, and so they can't really communicate with the parents. The parents ran a dry cleaning store until they were 75, and they just retired, and they're enjoying life. But what does that enjoying life look like? It's not what the children anticipated. And so I would say so many second and third generation Asian Americans are, in Korean words, 효자 and 효녀, like really good children. They really think a lot about their parents and want them to be happy. But I think that in some ways, what the second generation considers happiness and what first generation may not consider happiness, but they're okay with the survival that they have established. So I think the unity of goals have to be realigned, I think, for that kind of conversation to come together.
Which is really hard. I mean, I'm just thinking of my own family. And it's just because, as you said, I think your life goal is so different and your experience is so different. But also, I was wondering, do you see the differences between the people's sort of the attitude differences among, say, people, who came to the U.S., when the Korean immigration to the U.S. really started, which is the late 60s versus, early 70s, versus people who came here in the late 80s and early 90s. And also, obviously, they are different generations, but also Korea was a very different place. As you said, you carry what you remember from your own childhood. So these people who actually have memory of Korea as not the war-torn country that was suffering, but whose memory of Korea is this, really developing, financially becoming richer and richer and better. And nowadays, I'm sure the kids who are growing up in Korea has very different view of what Korea is now versus what it was before. So do you think they have different attitude, or is it still going to be the same generational thing when you are an immigrant to a new country that you know that you somehow sacrifice something for your children and their future?
Wow, that's a really hard question. I do think that Asian Americans who immigrated right after the end of the Chinese exclusion law, and in 1965 the Hartley Law passed, those who immigrated were professionals, so nurses, doctors, scientists. And so they already possessed some higher level of language skills, and they were professional families. And I think the parents of those generations actually assimilated as much as they could to become Americans. So a lot of my friends whose parents came as in the 60s, they're actually really fluent in English, And when I speak with them, I'm fluent in Korean. They don't speak to me in Korean, they speak to me in English. And their English is better than mine. So, but then the people who came in their 80s and 90s, I think that many of them I would identify as came for second chances. Something might not have been right in their country of origin. Also, if we think about the 80s and 90s, there were a number of refugee immigrants and people who could not turn back to go back to their countries. And there were people who came to work as domestic workers. And so I think that generation is a very different group altogether. And the kind of pressures that I've seen placed on their children is far rigid and I would say strict than those families who came very early on and they were very assimilated, and their children who are second generation had much more kind of privilege of choosing what they wanted to study or professions that they wanted to go into, whereas families who came in their 80s and 90s, and I would call many of them second chance in America, their children carry a lot of, I think, burdens to succeed on behalf of the family, and so letting go of their dreams. So I have a young person who went to Ivy League, and she wanted to become an English professor, and then her father died, and her mother doesn't work, so she had to drop out of grad school and go into tech and start supporting her mother. And she was very depressed and anxious. And it's only through therapy that she has really reclaimed her love. And she figured out a way to work a little bit, but she now is going to go to grad school for a PhD in English.
Oh.
Yeah. So I think that a lot of people, I just want to make a point about why people come to therapy. It's not to fix themselves, but therapy is a process where you begin to really put together a narrative that you can't imagine that existed. Your own narrative means a lot. Your story is extremely meaningful. Like your daughter who taught about her family history, she's already has this foundation of narrative that is really truthful. And I think that's a really important skill and foundation base that one needs. And a lot of times they don't have that. And in therapy, it's a space where you can really develop that narrative. And therapy is not scary. It's really a space where a therapist invites you to play together. Like this evening, we're having a real nice play date in a way. And hopefully, we'll get to talk to each other and to really imagine together, to be curious about yourself, to be spontaneous. I mean, I ask a lot of my patients, like, let's play. And they're like, oh, I don't know how to play. And I was like, didn't you play when you were a little kid? And they're like, no, I had to do piano, I had to do violin, I had to do soccer, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, And so it's really relearning how to play and how to really, say that I'm important.
I want to add to that piece also the importance of sort of telling your story. With the sort of the rise in hate crimes and hate incidences against Asian Americans these last 2 years, historically, obviously, these have existed even before the pandemic, but there's a major reluctance to report what's happening, right? Some people are undocumented, some people don't speak English, or there's just this idea as Asian Americans that we're supposed to be quiet, right? But there's this other phenomenon that's really interesting that I've read about, I've heard about, is that some people, it's hard to believe it's just happened to you. Even if it's like a violent act or some sort of harassment, you tend to downplay it in your mind, saying that couldn't have been me. I must have misheard that. I must have misheard that slur. I did that. I must have tripped and fallen. That person didn't push me. And then sort of studies now show that the rates of sort of like mental health issues, things like depression, anxiety, especially hypervigilance, is fairly high after you're on the receiving end of some kind of racial harassment. But here's an interesting thing that a lot of people don't realize. If you report that act of harassment or that racial violence against you, that mental illness, symptoms of mental illness decline significantly.
Mm-hmm.
Simply the act of reporting is part of the healing process.
Right, taking action.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really important point because Asian Americans are taught to resolve within, that if you speak up, it's weak. And, when bad things happen to us, our parents might say, well, dismiss it, don't make a fuss, don't speak up. And so that super ego voice of, no, you shouldn't speak up, you shouldn't take action. And I think what's been really, really great among young people and a lot of people coming forward to speak is that, yes, we have a voice and we want to really speak. And actually, the act of speaking, it's really important that you actually listen to yourself and that reduces the level of anxiety and level of absolutely. So that is an act of healing.
Right. And sometimes it's a simple act, going onto a website, clicking on a few buttons, filling out a form, saying, this happened to me. And then also, I think oftentimes as Asian Americans, we don't even understand the political significance of reporting these numbers. Because before the year 2019, we didn't even have statistics collected about what kind of racial harassment or violence had been committed against Asian Americans, and definitely not what the mental health impacts of those numbers were. But as those numbers are gathered, that's when the community gathers voice. That's when, as you mentioned, Jay, earlier, that there's sort of, I remember when the day the Atlanta shootings happened, and if you looked at social media feeds, it's almost like people of different races were living in different worlds.
Yeah.
Here's one stream here talking about St. Patrick's Day, and then sort of this really overwhelmed stream of sort of Asian American women friends that I had who are having a hard time knowing whether they should connect with the experience or not, right? But by reporting what's happened, it creates a voice so that those two streams can start to merge and meet in the middle, right? Where communities can start to understand one another.
I think that's really important point. And I do want to open up to questions to people soon, but I did have one question because, well, we're all women. We're identified as females. And you just talked about how your stream was, a lot of it was about Asian American women talking about the issues. I was just wondering, just in your field of expertise, based on your experience, do Asian men respond differently than Asian women to issues like this? I mean, I know that's a huge generalization, but
The few Asian American men in my practice, they are shaken. They, I think, no, not really. No.
no, but in terms of how they want to be open about it.
Mm.
You just said you have few Asian males in your practice.
Well, in general, women seek therapy more than men. But in my experience, men have been going to the rallies, men have been speaking up, men have been supportive of the women, and that they're taking action. I wouldn't really separate them.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's good to hear. Great. So if you have any questions, you can raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you. So does anybody have any questions? Because I can just go on and talk and talk and talk, but I don't know if you want to hear that. So if you're thinking of your questions, one of the things that it actually occurred to me while you were talking is that we talked a lot about sort of the family dynamic. The first generation, second generation, third generation. At least for Korean American community, and I believe for now there's a lot of Chinese American community. There's a huge part of the community that it does not have that generational thing going on. They are adoptees, and yet they are still Asian Americans, but sometimes they don't even know how to identify as Asian Americans because they did not grow up with Asian-looking family. So do you see how they process? I'm sure, being an adoptee, alone is a huge issue they always have to deal with and tackle with. But when it comes to them considering themselves as Asian American, do they have any difficulties? Do they have, or do they want to identify sometimes, or do they feel like they don't necessarily have to?
Um, I think one of the questions that we ask in the book is the adoptee an Asian American? Is the white parents Asian Americans? And certainly they are Asian American. And one of the unique aspects of Asian American adoptees is that, unlike your daughter who could come home and say, this girl said, we don't want Chinese. And you can actually validate her confusion, you can explain, you can match her affect. Whereas an adoptee doesn't have that validation. And one of the things that adoptees experience is that they're mourning in silence, they're mourning alone, and that their racial identity formation is, in a way, paused, right? Because their assimilation is so intense. Every single day, they live with people who don't look like you. And so, one of the things that our class watched was Deanne Bourget Liam's documentary on first person plural. And one of the things that she talks about is that I knew my name. I remember what my parents looked like in Korea. And, through this assimilation process, they were erased. And that I could not cry. That was not allowed because I'm grateful to be adopted. And I have to just really work hard to please my parents. But one of the good things about Korean Americans and Asian American adoptees for the last 20 years, I would say, there's a very, very strong group in New York called Also Known As. And there's also gatherings every few years with European adoptees and American adoptees that happen in Korea. Also, there's a very strong Chinese American families or Chinese adoptee families that are very, very active in New York. So I think that there has been some racial shift in being included. I hope that they're included. I hope they don't feel marginalized. But I would definitely want to have them be part of us. Absolutely, they are part of us.
I'm actually picking up the thread that you just said because I am a Korean adoptee, and
What's your name?
My name is Jeffrey.
Jeffrey, hi.
And I think something that struck me particularly during the Atlanta spa shootings, because I am part of an adoptee community, and one of my female adoptee friends who's also from Korea specifically said like her experience was so jarring because the shooter looked like someone in her own family. And it didn't, until she said that to me, like it really was just an incredible kind of like cognitive dissonance where it's like, you're so affected by obviously what happened, and yet you can kind of it's just a weird feeling. And I'm just kind of curious, I guess my question is like, what is the responsibility or what kind of support looks like from like non-Korean people, like whether it's your family or your company, like what does that support look like? And what can they do to help build the resilience with us?
That's a really good question. I mean, like what your friend said is just so profound, right? And one of the things about this film conveyed so well is that the family who adopted Deanne was just so happy that it erased her sadness and terror. I mean, this little girl walks out of the airplane and she looks terrified. But the mother admits that because they were so ecstatic that they just dismissed her sadness. And I think that families may not fully understand the experience of loss and the community that we're mourning together. But I think what would be really helpful is to acknowledge that they may not understand fully, but that they're there to really listen and to validate your experience. Even if they don't understand, even if they will never experience it. And that's the privilege and the entitlement, right? They will never experience it. But the fact that they want to listen and want to validate your feelings and your experiences is a beginning.
I want to add to that. After this essay I published last year in the Times, I actually had hundreds of responses from readers in the next few days, both Asian American and not Asian American. And of course, the Asian Americans were grateful. They're empathetic. They're like, these are answers I was looking for. But those who are not Asian American, I actually received a number of apologies from people saying, I'm so sorry. I was blind to what was happening in your community. I just didn't know, and this was a wake-up call for me. And I also heard from people who were like on their boards of their companies or leaders at their school, in their school districts, saying like, what resources can I look to? How can I collect these stories like yours and bring them into our organizations? So people actually brought these resources, including this essay, into their corporate training rooms, into their HR departments, into their diversity and equity initiative team departments. And I heard from people who wanted to be allies, and even though they weren't Asian American, they were saying, "How can I create reporting systems with my organization?" So if there is racial harassment that happens, lots of places don't even have a way of like speaking up, of employees speaking up about what's happened, or what resources can I point people to if they've experienced these things and now are experiencing the mental health impacts as a result. And then of course there are book clubs. Lots of people wanted to start book clubs, so which I think is a good starting point. Because we talked about here that stories matter. But I think you got to do more than just read the book. You have to read the book, and then you need to gather like this and talk about what can we do in our community about the stories we've just heard.
You know, as you asked that question, and Heidi's really important point, there's a couple things. Why do white parents adopt Asian children and not other children from other countries, right? So we have to raise that as a question. In so many ways, Asian Americans have been adjacent to whiteness. We have been adjacent to that mimicry of whiteness, and that comes with this stereotype of we must be compliant and we must live in this kind of colorblind denial, even when violence happens right in front of us or it happens to us. And the triangulation of Asian, Black, and whiteness, where there's this kind of attack on the Asian Americans, right, as the model minority, and pitting that against the other POCs, it really, that's where we lost our voice. And that racial conversations are all binary. It rarely ever includes Asian Americans. And this is where, like Heidi's writing, you speaking up, and this kind of forum is a way to really enter that conversation.
I have just to add to the gentleman's comment, but I have another question. Also, in some of my work, I think a lot of this comes up with biracial Asians as well, and kind of experiencing either a willing or unwilling erasure of their identity as an Asian. And then if they get partnered within their own family, right, not sort of having that juxtaposition of Asian and usually white, or being partnered with people who are now white and sort of this awakening happening over the past couple of years. So yeah, I just wanted to appreciate that point. But I have a question actually about, so like elders, right? And in the sense of my parents' generation, I feel like I see a lot of mental health issues within my parents' generation, 70s, 80s, and they're not given the opportunities, resources, tools to actually deal with that emotional side that you were talking about earlier. But particularly for immigrants, right, who came here and were in survival mode for the past essentially 30 years, 40 years in the US, and then now, retiring, maybe being able to enjoy the fruits of their labor. But from what I've seen, there's a lot of depression that happens, right? Because their identity as a worker, as somebody who's just trying to survive, is taken away, right? So it's sort of like, who am I now, right? My children don't need me anymore. I'm comfortable, but what's my purpose? And sort of just trying to, I guess my question is like, how do we serve our elders in that way, particularly if they're not necessarily open to talking about mental health, right? Or because I think I've seen kind of extremes from just sort of like low-level depression to more serious mental health issues. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with that. I get calls all the time, like, can you talk to my parents? And there is such limitation to like people who speak or who are fluent in, let's say, Mandarin or Cantonese or Korean or Japanese. And it's really unfortunate. One of the statistics is that Chinese women over the ages of 65 have the highest suicide rate, which is so alarming and sad. And I think one of the things that I hope that we can do is to really be proud of them. I mean, they're amazing. Like, can you imagine going to like, I don't know, like France at age 35 and like learning French and like opening a store and taking their kids to school? I mean, you're laughing, but I'm not that courageous. And I think that one of the things that our class in their papers, a lot of them wrote about their parents' accents. And I wonder what it would be like to tell your parents, I'm really proud of your accent, because that says that you have a history, you have a really rich history that you bring with you, you have a voice, and you have another language, maybe two or three, and that I want you to know that we're really proud of you for all this thing. And I think that what you said about purpose, their sense of purpose is in shift, and that verbalizing to your parents that you love them, even though it's already understood, but not expressed. And I think this is where we can really offer them the kind, that depression is very hard, but we need to label it. We need to actually say, well, mom, I think you might have some depression symptoms look like X, Y, and Z, and you've been telling me all these things. And so can we go see a doctor together? It doesn't have to be a therapist, but it could be a doctor, because then they can refer, and so there's also now in New York this website called Bridges Mental Health, and it only lists Asian American therapists. So there's now like more of a place where we can refer more of our parents and take care of them.
And to add to that, Dr. Han, I had a question. We spoke earlier about the different waves of immigration, particularly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which is sort of the height of Korean American immigration. But many were escaping, different political instabilities in Korea and a country coming out of poverty and war. But obviously now Korea has developed in so many ways and is so different from the country that that generation has left. What is it like for this generation now? They're retiring. They've come to maybe they have space and time in their lives, but they left a place intentionally, seeking a quote unquote better life, not expecting Korea to become what it has.
Yeah, or
What
China, or
or China,
Vietnam, or
right?
So Salman Akhtar, who wrote about third individuation, talks about various immigrants and the process of developing a third identity, third individuation. And one of the things that he talks about is that the healthiest people who can actually incorporate and develop with the developing country are those who visit often. But those who don't visit and then 30 years later they go and they're like having a culture shock because like what happened to, the Han River or um
Yeah.
and so one of the things that I mean, I haven't gone to Korea in a long time, but um it's also a culture shock for me. And so I think that one way is to actually take your parents and go often and to immerse themselves. Yes.
My parents, my dad's 88, and my mom's 7 years younger. And I was very lucky in the aughts to travel to China and Asia with them every year. And it was only on those trips where they would begin to talk about their history. Before that, when we were here, we came here in 79, so I'm 1.5 as well. I would hear bits and pieces, but not really know the whole story. But in traveling and going with him to visit the places they lived in, that was therapy for us. And I think what I came through after this was to accept them for who they are from where they came from. Because I could never imagine that.
Absolutely.
Japanese war, seeing death, bombs dropped. He survived more than I could ever know. I couldn't even begin to judge them on those things. So I'm like, I accept you. I can't accept it. I don't know, but I love you and I'll try. And as a Chinese American bicultural, I'm different. We grew up in a more Western society. Many of these concepts are Western origin. It doesn't apply to them. They were survival mode, and they've made it. So I'm like, I'm gonna leave it, and I accept it, and I have my own conception, and I'll love you for that. And it's been hard because it took me a long time to get there. But I had Asian American Studies in college, so I was very lucky because I had that available in the mid '90s, and it kind of laid there in the soil for a good 2 or 3 decades until this moment, which I actually feel is as seminal as the original 68, 69 Asian American movement for the
Absolutely.
community building and what the possibilities are for what's to come.
Thank you.
Thank you. So on that note, I wanted to end with actually, we were talking about this in the back. We titled this program Building Resilience. And then I found out that Dr. Han really does not like the word resilience. But we also talked about, so what does it really mean to be resilient? And I wanted to hear from both of you what that means to you.
Why don't you go ahead, Heidi?
Oh, that's such a big question. What does it mean to be resilient? Well, to many of your points, we talked about sort of how mental health and trauma has looked as an Asian American identity has looked through very many generations until now, right? And sometimes something that I often hear from others who've been to therapy is something like, well, my immigrant parents did the best that they could with what they had, with the limitations that they had. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Han, part of resilience is accepting that that is the truth and that we have resilient immigrant parents, and also accepting the trauma that happens with immigration and that we live in the shadow of that trauma for generations. But what do we do with all that's been handed to us? For my family, resilience has looked like teaching my daughter what it means to be Asian American, the good, the hard, the bad, and the great in the history. That what we're experiencing now as a generation in the pandemic and with the violence against Asian American women in New York, it's tragic. It's not new. It's happened before, but our community has responded and we've won in the past.
I totally agree with you. I look at resilience, and the thing that I was telling you guys was the Korean word chama, like suppress and just keep going. And that's not resilience. Resilience, I would just add to what Heidi, you were saying, um, is the vulnerability. We are all feeling extremely vulnerable. And it's only with that openness to vulnerability we begin to feel courageous. And that courage, by talking to you, now we are two. Talking to you, we are three. Talking in here, we are now 50. And taking that outside and sharing it with your friends and family, then it becomes 100, and so on. That's the resilience building. And that we want to be vulnerable. We don't want to look strong. We don't want to like have this shield all the time. We want to be courageous, and we are. And that in itself is really the truth in resilience, I feel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Han. Thank you so much,
Thank
Heidi,
you.
for joining us
Thank you,
tonight.
Tate.
This has been just so wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you
And
for
thanks,
having us.
everybody.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Hmm.